I'm gonna keep this intro and hopefully the video as well nice and concise, so listen. After posting my video where I explained my contentions with 10 different Bleach metas, let's just say I was met with conflicting responses. But one thing that surprised me was that out of all of the different metas I went over, the one that got the most, let's say, backlash was the Yhwach one, which I thought was pretty straightforward. So I'm making this video to present the counter arguments that I've seen and explain my contentions with them. Before you watch this video, I highly advise you to watch the Yhwach section of my previous video if you haven't already, since this video is basically a follow-up to that. Thus, without wasting any more time, let's get into it. Before I get into actually going over the counters, let me explain my argument in a summarized manner. In one of the Can't Fear Your Own World novels, alongside chapters 615 and 686, it's implied multiple different times that Yhwach planned to undo the division of the original universe the Soul King was used to create millennia before the present. The way he planned to undo the division was by killing the Soul King, which would have disrupted the cycle of souls on a universal scale. This would have resulted in the realms flowing into each other, causing them to merge and become one large realm where there's no distinction between life and death. This doesn't mean that Yhwach wouldn't actually physically scale to the obliteration of all of the contents within the realms. Thus it debunks the common belief that he was going to physically destroy the realms with his raw spiritual pressure. Thus the summary to my argument is that Yhwach doesn't scale to the obliteration of the realms because the way he was going to destroy the realms wasn't with his raw strength, if not via alternative means. Now I'll move on to explain the problem with basically any argument that is made in refutation to my own. Most counter arguments will always try to arrive at the ultimate conclusion of Yhwach using his spiritual pressure to destroy the realms. This is a problem because it creates massive inconsistencies and countless contradictions with multiple statements, as this complete eradication of everything doesn't coincide with Yhwach's plan. Moreover, the statements that tend to suggest that Yhwach was going to physically destroy the realms have different interpretations that make it consistent with the narrative, and even if it is taken as being absolutely literal, they are outweighed by solid narrative statements and implications, since one or two vague statements are being stacked against like 10 different statements by multiple different characters, including Yhwach himself. The counter arguments will try to rationalize these contradictions by saying that Yhwach was going to recreate all of the realms. This is an assumption known as an ad hoc rationalization, where you try to stop your argument from being falsified by making an unfounded assumption. Now, I'm not going to act like my argument doesn't have any rationalization, as due to Kubo's poetic nature, he tends to not fully explain everything and leave some things up to interpretation. Thus, there are certain parts of my hypothesis that aren't explained by the narrative itself, at least in a direct sense. However, the rationalizations my hypothesis makes aren't as extraordinary as saying Yhwach was going to recreate the entire realms, as you'll soon see. Thus, via Occam's razor, or preponderance of probabilities, and the Sagan standard, I believe my argument to be superior to the ones presented in counter to it. My reasoning being that the rationalizations my argument makes aren't as extraordinary as the ones the counter argument use. Thus, they require less evidence to prove, making them more likely than their competition. The first counter basically asks, why did Yhwach become the new Soul King and begin cycling the souls between realms after absorbing Mimihagi? Like, if his plan was to create a new world via disrupting the cycle of souls, why did he do something that seemingly contradicts it? This is something that I initially couldn't explain when it was brought up in conversation, thus I needed to rationalize it. However, after rereading a few chapters, I can answer the question. In chapter 485, Yhwach implies that he's making foundations to invade the Soul Society. In chapters 626 through 629, Yhwach talks about how Vavel is the foundation of the new world and implies that its creation is the next thing he has to do following the absorption of Mimihagi and the Soul King. In chapters 627 through 629, Jugram basically implies that following the creation of Vavel, Yhwach plans to eliminate everyone who is invading Vavel. So let's unpack what all of this means and how it answers the question that is being asked. Well, it implies that Yhwach's plan was multifaceted in nature. First it was to invade the Soul Society, then it was to create the supposed cornerstone for the new world, the Vavel, then it was to eliminate everyone who posed a threat before moving on to creating the new world. His ultimate goal was always to create a new world. but they were things that he needed or wanted to do before creating the new world. This is why he didn't just create a new world instantaneously following the elimination of the Soul King. As to why he wanted or needed to do the aforementioned, it's unknown. I could give some rationalizations, but for the sake of brevity, I won't. It's also not necessary, since the goal is to explain why he didn't destroy the realms immediately, not why his plan was multifaceted. Do keep in mind that what I just laid out isn't the only indication of his plan being multifaceted, since if it wasn't, there wouldn't be any reason for him to talk to Aizen, to form the Stormbitters, etc. But there's no need to go over every single piece of evidence, since it's pretty clear that his plan was multifaceted. The argument goes that in chapter 627, Ganju states that the Garganta is going to be destroyed if Yhwach isn't defeated. Since the Garganta isn't part of the soul cycle, this counter argues that it implies that Yhwach was going to use his physical strength to destroy it rather than using the soul cycle, which was my argument. Supporting this is that in chapter 684, Yhwach states that by his power the realms are going to be destroyed. Following this, we see his spiritual pressure spreading throughout the Soul Society. The presumption is that Yhwach will be able to physically destroy the realms, thus he scales to their destruction. Now for my contentions. The easiest way to counter this is by saying that in chapter 615, Yhwach states that anything connected to the Soul Society will be destroyed as a result of being connected to the Soul Society. The reason this would include the Garganta is because in the Mass Data Book and in one of the Can't Fear Your Own World novels, it's defined as a void that surrounds the realms and is analogically similar to outer space, while the realms are similar to planets. Thus it would be similar to how outer space is connected to the planets, or how a balloon on Earth is connected to Earth's atmosphere. Like, imagine if I'm being housed by a void. Am I not connected to that void in some way, shape, or form? Moreover, the Garganta is stated to function as a pathway that connects Hueco and the other realms. In order for this to be true, there has to be some sort of relationship or connection between Garganta and the other realms. It's pretty clear that if Garganta was truly going to be destroyed, then there's a valid explanation as to why. But even if it wasn't, this argument doesn't circumvent the problems I laid out with trying to counter my argument. I won't be saying that at the end of every single section, so just keep it in mind. This counter-argument claims that Yhwach's plan wasn't to remove a boundary between life and death via affecting the cycle of souls. The reasoning behind it is that in chapters 480 and 485, it stated that just by killing off hollows, the soul cycle was already being significantly affected to the point that if it continued for a few days, Yhwach's plan would have been realized. The problem I have with this counter is that it's in contradiction with an ungodly amount of evidence, and it ignores the fact that there are multiple answers to the question it holds. Moreover, this is something that is explained when you answer the question as to why Yhwach was to stay in the realms after killing the Soul King, as I did previously. On top of that, there are reasons to believe as to why he couldn't just continue killing hollows to create the new world. These reasons being that the Soul Society would have created countermeasures to slow down the process, such as forcefully transporting souls from one realm to the other to maintain the balance, or they could just kill people from one realm in order to achieve the same effect. This is something that should be more desirable than the complete elimination of the boundary between life and death and the nullification of the history of both realms. Moreover, it's also possible for the Soul Reapers to just fight the Quincy for disturbing the balance just like they did 1,000 years ago, as in chapter 480, Mairi had already arrived at the conclusion that it was the Quincy's doing. Like, killing hollows in mass and disrupting the soul cycle was something that happened a millennia ago, and it was what led to the near complete extermination of Quincy. With Yhwach knowing this, why would he do the same thing again? Sure, he had countermeasures such as the medallion that absorbs Zanpakuto spirits, but this wouldn't guarantee his victory. So rather than just being sitting ducks and waiting for the Soul Reapers to attack them for disturbing the balance of souls via killing hollows, why not just remove the Lichpin? This would universally disrupt the cycle of souls and cause the realms to collapse immediately. This is unless there's someone to become the new Soul King in that short time frame. The realms being united as one is something that is imperative to Yhwach's plan, and it has mountains of evidence supporting it. This counter is more so asking a question rather than giving an alternative to the mountains of evidence that counter it. Moreover, the question can be answered by making valid rationalizations, as I just did. On top of all of that, the statements about the realms going to collapse in a few days are made by characters other than Yhwach, while the statements about the world becoming one are made by Yhwach himself alongside other characters. This means that the world becoming one and there being no differentiation between life and death is something that is true and Yhwach wanted it. Thus, there must have been some reason for Yhwach to not just eliminate hollows to achieve this effect. The reason is never actually explained, thus we must give rationalizations as to why he stopped eliminating hollows, since we already know that the unification of the world was something Yhwach wanted as previously explained. Thus, there must have been a reason for him to not just eliminate hollows to achieve this effect, as I just stated. I gave multiple reasons as to why he didn't just eliminate hollows to achieve the final facet of his goal. I feel like I'm going around in circles repeating myself, which makes everything feel complicated, so allow me to give a concise explanation which will conclude this section. This counter doesn't work because it isn't really a counter argument, since it isn't given an alternative and it's more like a question that is being asked. This question has a basis in things that seemingly contradict Yhwach's plan, but there are valid rationalizations that can be made for the statements to make sense and be consistent. One can apply Occam's razor and ask, which is more plausible? The rationalizations I gave, which makes everything consistent and makes sense, or a few statements that this counter is based on that are contradicted by mountains of evidence. In my opinion, the counter is far more plausible and makes far more sense, which is why this counter doesn't work. This counter argument, if you can even call it that, says that the statements made by other characters are incredible because we don't know if they're knowledgeable on what they're talking about. So if a random character that hasn't interacted with Yhwach says something about Yhwach or his plan, we cannot use that statement unless one can prove that what they're saying is correct. There are so many problems with this stance that I could make an entire video on it, but for the sake of brevity, I'll try to explain it as concisely as possible. Okay, so when a character makes a statement, we always presume that what they're saying is correct and that they are knowledgeable on the subject. This is true unless the statement is contradicted or there is reason to believe that the character was lying, but other than that, the aforementioned is a general rule. Without this presumption, you open up Pandora's box and delve into nasty territory where you make it possible to say things such as, prove that this statement is true. As a result, you also open up the idea of a Man Fallacy. I made an entire post about it, but the basic premise is that you cannot prove something is truly objective. You can just present evidence until it is said to be more plausible than another hypothesis. To exemplify this, nothing we currently believe to be true can actually be proven to be truly objective. The reason for this is that it has the presupposition that the information the human brain processes is correct, which isn't something that can be proven. It's just something that is more likely to be true than not due to the preponderance of probabilities. This is why you can never claim that something is actually impossible. You can just say that it's extremely unlikely or that there isn't any reason to believe it to be the case. Moving back to the point at hand, if you do not presume that, as a general rule, any statement made is correct, you will never be able to assert anything if your sources are something a character says. Allow me to exemplify what I mean. Let's take this scenario if a character, let's call her Ashley, works at a research center and states that a drug would cause people to lose their hair if they ingest it. The first thing one can say is prove that what she's saying is true. Let's say you show her working at the research facility in question. The next question would be prove that it is a research facility. Without input from the author or some, all you can really do is say that it's likely a research facility because of how it looks and the way it's portrayed within the series. Another request would be to prove that Ashley's perception of the drug and its effects are accurate. I don't know what kind of evidence you can even use to prove that unless you have like the author on speed dial or something. Moreover, the question itself delves into the presumption we humans make, which is that what we see as the truth, as I previously explained. Thus, I can be like, prove that the statement you are reading is what was truly written. So as you can see, without that presumption, someone attacking a claim you make on the basis of a statement made by a character can ask you to simply prove the countless presuppositions you're making to the point it becomes absurd, where they're asking you to prove something objectively. And unless you're in contact with the author, you'll arrive at a point where you can no longer provide evidence for your claims to prove what is being asked to be proven. Even if you have the author on the line, they can ask you to prove that it's actually the author, or that what you believe the author is saying is like what they're actually saying. I highly recommend you to check out my post on the Man Fallacy to better exemplify the absurdity of it. Even excluding what I just said, we have to take a step back and look at it from a real world perspective. None of these characters in these fictional stories are real. Well, as far as we know, they aren't. This means that any statement they make is the author writing. The author makes these characters say whatever it is they're saying. This means that whenever the author wants to explain a principle, they will generally explain it through a character. It's not like they would interject at every instance to explain something to both the audience and the character in question. Like when the author wants to explain their power system in a graphic novel, they won't just interject and explain it themselves as if they themselves can talk to a fictional character they created. Sure, sometimes they do explain things from like an omniscient point of view, but I'd say that most of the time when a power system is being explained, a character does most of the talking rather than the author. An example of this is when Gojo was explaining curse energy and curse techniques to Yuji. Thus, when a character says something or explains something, we generally don't ask why do they know that, we just presume that they are knowledgeable about it because it's the author explaining a concept through the character. So to conclude this section, this counter doesn't work because it delves into crazy territory about proof and validity as a whole, while also ignoring the fact that, for the most part, when a character explains something, it's the author trying to explain to the audience a concept. Thus it's likely that whatever they're saying is true, even though us readers cannot directly prove it. This argument goes that in chapter 684, we see Yhwach spread his spiritual pressure across the soul society while saying that due to his power, the world will become one and lose their shape. Given that anything that comes into contact with his spiritual pressure is generally destroyed, as seen in chapter 682, this counter claims that it is self-evident that he was going to physically destroy the realms, thus scaling to them. While not part of his original argument, I'll try to make it consistent with his plan, i.e. Steelman the counter. The Steelman is that in chapter 565, it stated that once someone who Yhwach has impacted part of his soul to dies, he gains all of their knowledge, abilities, and talents. This means that when Grammy died, Yhwach gained the visionary ability. Thus, when Yhwach destroys the realms, he can use Visionary's imaginary powers to restore them in any form he sees fit, which would circumvent one of the inherent problems I laid out with any counter to my Yhwach meta refutation. Adding to the counter argument, you could say that the way Yhwach was going to recreate the realms was similar to how he used destroyed buildings to create his own town in chapters 627 and 628. This is an alternative explanation that is consistent with the narrative while also allowing for Yhwach to scale to the realms. Here's my contentions with the counter. Firstly, I'll go over Visionary. I believe it's unlikely that Visionary can truly turn anything the user wishes into reality. Like if Visionary was so powerful that it can recreate entire realms and modify entire cosmologies, then surely it can destroy them since creating something requires far more effort than destroying it due to the 9 infinite moving parts of matter, energy, and systems as a whole. If this is the case, then why didn't Yhwach just use Visionary to achieve his goal? He could have just been like, return the world the way it was prior to the Soul King dividing it or something alongside those lines. This is something that is far more convenient than straight up spreading his spiritual pressure across every cubic centimeter of every realm and destroying it. Like, rather than just sending his subordinates to fight everyone, why didn't he just use Visionary and say, like, stop the minds of those who oppose me from working? This is why I believe Visionary has limitations, and it just can't do anything the user wishes, since if it could, there are multiple things Yhwach could have wished for which would have made everything far more efficient and allowed him to realize his goals faster. Actually, by definition, Visionary would have to have limitations, since if it doesn't, it delves into the inherent problems with claims of omnipotence. Like if Visionary can do anything, then it means it can create a perfect cubic centimeter of a material that cannot be destroyed. But if this is the case, then it means it cannot use its own powers to destroy this material, since if it does, then it contradicts the fact that this material is indestructible. So as you can see, the ability would inherently have limitations, which would explain why there are situations in which Yhwach didn't use it. Even if you wanted to say that, since Grimray has already shown the ability to create universal structures, it shouldn't be that massive of a leap to say he can recreate the entire cosmology. The problem with this is that there is a massive difference between creating outer space and creating the equivalent of multiple universes where the concepts of both life and death are united as one. Like, the latter is an extraordinarily greater feat than the prior, and just because something is in the same range doesn't mean it's plausible an entity can achieve anything within that range. Like, both Earth and Jupiter are planets, but just because someone can destroy Earth doesn't mean they can do the same thing to Jupiter. Though to be fair, if you can destroy the Earth, then the possibility of you being able to destroy Jupiter is higher than it would have been if you didn't destroy the Earth. So the chances of Visionary being able to recreate the entire realms is higher than it would have been due to the fact that Grimmy had created outer space. However, this reasoning isn't that solid, so you cannot say that it's very likely that it can perform the required feat. Secondly, I'll move on to Yhwach using something that's already destroyed to create something new. The problem I have with this is that Yhwach used chunks of buildings that were destroyed in the sense that they were no longer together to form a whole building. They weren't destroyed in the sense that they were pulverized, if not they were just divided into significantly massive chunks. This is noteworthy because if he was truly going to destroy all matter, then he would have to pulverize it or outright remove it from existence in its entirety. If he is pulverizing every chunk of all matter in the realms, then saying that he can reform them the same way he did so with a town is a gargantuan rationalization. Him reforming the town is already shown to be an impressive feat. Doing it on a universal scale is a far too large rationalization that has minuscule evidence and relies on the fact that Yhwach was going to physically destroy the realms, which is something I'll touch on soon. Even if he wasn't going to polarize them, what was he going to do about all of the energy within the universe? Things such as photons and radiation have to mass their energy. That's unless you're applying the idea of mass energy equivalence. Like saying he can reshape energy is another massive rationalization. And even if you say that he didn't need to, then there's a vast amount of energy that's just lying there, and it will partly contradict him destroying the realms, since all of that energy is also part of the realms. And lastly, I'll talk about the statement Yhwach himself makes alongside the spreading of his spiritual pressure. The main problem is that it has another interpretation that is more consistent with the plot. This interpretation is that Yhwach is basically saying that due to him ceasing the cycling of souls, the worlds will crumble. This makes sense as in chapter 626, it's implied that without Yhwach using his powers to regulate the cycle of souls, the world will crumble as he is the new Soul King. Thus, the statement that is made makes perfect sense when you consider that his power is what holds existence together. The problem with this is that it doesn't explain why Yhwach was spreading his spiritual pressure across the Saidate and outside of it. However, this can be explained by the fact that, as I stated in a previous section, Yhwach's plan was multifaceted, and one of the aspects of it was to eliminate everyone who posed a threat as he was through with them, i.e. Ichigo and company. This is supported by the fact that in chapter 684, Yhwach seems to become enraged after Ichigo one-shots him in the previous chapter. He also began attacking both Aizen and Ichigo simultaneously, which is in contrast to how he was prior to Ichigo killing him for the first time. Unlike the other counters, this one doesn't have a direct explanation, since it's more of another interpretation of what's already known with different argumentation to support another conclusion. So when faced with two competing hypotheses, you have to evaluate them by comparing the amount of rationalizations they make alongside the magnitudes of the claims before applying a preponderance of probabilities to see which should be perceived as being true on the basis of plausibility. So let's start off with laying out the claims the counter makes. Firstly, it claims that Yhwach's spiritual pressure can cover every cubic centimeter of each realm. Secondly, it claims that Yhwach was going to use Visionary to recreate the realms. Thirdly, it claims that Visionary is powerful enough to create a large universe where there's no differentiation between life and death. You can substitute the claims about Visionary for the claims about him recreating the realm, similar to how he recreated the town. In which case, the claims will be that he can use it on a universal scale, that he can use it to affect both physical and spiritual matter, and possibly alongside affecting energy as well. This argument, or hypothesis or whatever you want to call it, has between 3 and 4 different claims. I've already explained what substantiates them, but to summarize, it would be that Grimmy created outer space. Yhwach made one statement about the realms becoming one before his power. We see his spiritual power cover the Saidate and burst out of the ground outside of the Saidate. We see him use his spiritual pressure to not only damage others, but also the area around him. And we see him use his powers to create Vavelt. Now for my argument. The first claim I make is that Yhwach was going to undo the division between life and death that the Soul King was used to create millennia before the present via disrupting the cycle of souls. Secondly, I claim that Yhwach was spreading his spiritual pressure because he wanted to eliminate everyone that posed a threat. I make two claims, and they are substantiated by the fact that there are multiple statements in the manga and in the Can't Fear Your Own World novels which go over Yhwach's ultimate goal or makes hints to it. There are other claims that my argument makes, but I didn't mention them because most of them are shared by the counter argument. Like, the fact that the realms were going to be united is pretty evident, which is why the counter argument has to make rationalizations as to how Yhwach was going to achieve it. And whether or not Garganta was going to be destroyed is also something that is shared, because if it wasn't, then it doesn't make any sense to include it as a claim. But if it was, then it stated that if they don't defeat Yhwach, then it is something that's going to happen. So if Yhwach was going to undo the division or just outright destroy everything, Garganta was going to be destroyed as a result either way. And the destruction of Garganta is insignificant as a claim since it's easily explained via basic deduction. I also didn't include the claims such as saying that his plan was multifaceted in nature, since, as previously stated, it is something that is shared by the counter-argument, since you can just ask, why didn't Yhwach just destroy the realms instantaneously after gaining the Soul King's power? So the claims presented are more so claims that differ based on the hypothesis, while there are other claims that are being made which are shared by both arguments, so there's no need to include them as claims when you're comparing both of them. As previously stated, something that supports my explanation as to why Yhwach was spreading his spiritual pressure across the Sairete is that it was within his plan to eliminate anyone who posed a threat. And after he is killed by Ichigo for the first time, he becomes enraged, which is in a juxtaposition with his prior self, giving him a motive to do so. So to finalize this section, I'll give a comprehensive summary as to why I believe my argument reigns supreme. Applying Okram's razor, which sounds more likely, that Yhwach was going to destroy and recreate all of the realms with his raw strength and or with visionary, or that he was going to disrupt the cycle of souls to achieve the same effect. In my opinion, the latter is far more likely, since, as I've pointed out within this video, the counter-argument makes claims that are far more extraordinary than my own and have less evidence to substantiate it than my own. Moreover, it makes countless rationalizations, many of which are unnecessary with my argument. Like the idea of Visionary being able to recreate the realms after Yhwach destroys them is put into question by the fact that Visionary clearly has limitations and isn't just an omnipotent or nigh-omnipotent wish-granting ability. Supporting this is the fact that there are countless instances in which Yhwach could have used Visionary and caused his plans to be realized, but he never did. In my opinion, the most plausible explanation as to why is because he couldn't, as Visionary has limitations. Though, to be fair, Visionary was able to recreate the entirety of outer space, showing that it is very powerful. And the chances of it being able to recreate the entire cosmology is higher than it would have been if it didn't recreate the entirety of outer space, as I previously explained. You can completely ignore the integration of Visionary into the meta and just say that Yhwach was going to recreate the entire cosmology the same way he recreated a town. But if you actually think about it, this counter is insinuating that Yhwach was going to spread his spiritual pressure across the entirety of the Soul Society, encompassing every atom within the realm, and it was going to spread to the living world through the Dagai and do the same thing. Moreover, it implies that Yhwach will open a gate and allow his spiritual pressure to arrive in Wakamundo and cover it in its entirety via traveling through either the living world or the Soul Society through the Garganta. Then, after destroying everything, he was going to use the pieces of everything that was left behind and recreate the entire cosmology the same way he recreated a town. The recreation of a town is portrayed to be incredibly impressive. Now imagine doing this on a universal scale. Now I ask you, does this not make less sense than just saying that Yhwach was going to kill everyone who posed a threat, i.e. Aizen, Ichigo, Kenpachi, etc.? Like, everyone who posed a threat was already within the Soul Society, and the amount of people that could interfere with Yhwach's plan at that time was a small minority of people. The lengths and rationalizations you have to go through to say that Yhwach was going to physically destroy the realms and all of its contents are insane. Like, compare that to saying that he was just going to disrupt the cycle of souls, which would have caused the same effect to happen with far less effort and would have been extraordinarily more convenient, since it straight up stated that the realms would collapse if there isn't a Soul King. I.e., if Yhwach stopped sustaining the cycle of souls, everything would collapse, which would allow him to realize his goal with far less effort, as I just stated. Now that we have all of that out of the way, I'll move on to summarizing why the counters don't work. Firstly, Yhwach upholding the balance is easily explained by the evidence of his plan being multifaceted in nature. Secondly, the Garganta being destroyed is explained by the fact that Yhwach states anything connected to the Soul Society will be destroyed, which would include the Garganta. Thirdly, Yhwach being able to affect the balance of souls just by killing Hollows, which would have led him to achieving his ultimate goal, is explained by the fact that his plan was multifaceted in nature and it didn't make sense for him going to unite the realms at that point in time. Moreover, there's reason to believe that if he tried to do so, his plan could have been interfered with by the Soul Society. Fourthly, the argument that we shouldn't believe what characters are saying because we cannot prove that they're knowledgeable on what they're speaking of delves into retarded territory of proof and validity, and it makes power scaling virtually impossible since you could just Y-man everything, which will lead to people being unable to use statements made by characters unless it's substantiated by the authors themselves. And even then, you can continue to Y-man it, and it overall just makes sense to presume a character is knowledgeable on what they're speaking of unless they're contradicted or there's reason to believe that they are wrong. Lastly, we have the destruction and recreation hypothesis. This doesn't work because it makes more rationalizations than my argument and its claims are more extraordinary. You have to go through so many mental gymnastics to justify this argument, while mine is pretty straightforward. And when you apply the preponderance of probabilities, it's evident that my argument just makes more sense and is more valid. Even if for some unknown reason you want to say that both hypotheses are equal, thus you can assert one being over the other, this just works in my favor since if you can't assert either, then you cannot claim that Yhwach scales to the realms. So it isn't just about providing an alternative, you have to prove that said alternative is logically more plausible than my own hypothesis. And yeah, that's about all I wanted to talk about. Hopefully I don't have to talk about this again, and I probably won't respond to any counter arguments presented in the form of posts unless I deem them to be valid. But I'm still down to discuss this subject in a call, so if anyone has any contentions, y'all can DM me. And yeah, that's about it. Bye.